Do you spend hours in your head thinking about something that happened, could have happened, or might happen? Do you ask others what to do so you don't make a mistake? Welcome to the Playing It Safe podcast. I am Dr. Z, your host. I am a clinical psychologist, an author, and a person that is super passionate about sharing with you science-based skills to overcome any type of fear-based struggles. Who doesn't experience fear? Who doesn't play it safe? In this show, we will discuss how fear-based reactions happen in day-to-day life, how playing it safe behaviors look like, sound like, and feel like, how you can put into action solid tips from behavioral science to get unstuck from worries, fears, obsessions, and anxieties, and how you can start doing what works, what matters, and what you care about. Behavioral science doesn't have to be boring. Thanks for listening, and let's get started. Hi guys! I want to start this episode by sharing with all of you one of my favorite quotes from Brene Brown. Here is the quote. Wholehearted living is about engaging in our lives from a place of worthiness. It means cultivating the courage, compassion, and connection to wake up in the morning and think, no matter what gets done and how much is left undone, I am enough. It's going to bed at night thinking, yes, I am imperfect and vulnerable, and sometimes afraid, but that doesn't change the truth that I am also brave and worthy of love and belonging. This is one of my favorite quotes from Brene Brown. And with this quote, I want to introduce you to a recent conversation I had with a colleague and a friend, Jonny Say, about self-compassion, what's unique about compassion-focused therapy, what's behind our self-criticisms, and how we can learn different ways to relate to them. This is one of my favorite conversations. You will hear how Jonny developed an interest and passion for compassion-focused therapy, how he combines acceptance and commitment therapy and compassion-focused practices, and how he found his way by developing a kind response towards his struggles. I hope this conversation is helpful in how you relate to self-criticism, and keep in mind that this is part one of my conversation with Jonny. In the next couple of days, I am going to release part two, so please stay tuned. Well, Jonny, thank you so much for making the time to chat with me. I know it's 9 p.m. right now in London, UK, so many thanks.
It's my pleasure, and I'm waking up every moment that we talk, so it's a good thing.
I appreciate it, because this is the first time that I'm interviewing you in the podcast. Do you mind introducing yourself and telling us what you're doing these days and how did you get involved into compassion-focused therapy?
Sure, yeah. So I live in London, and I am a therapist. I work in private practice and in the NHS, the National Health Service as well. And I guess my journey with compassion is a longer one, actually. I think really, to keep it simple, I guess I have my own mental health history. So I struggled with first of all, panic and depersonalization from a very young age, and OCD from like 6 years old, and a lot of my younger life, and then social anxiety and depression. So I had a lot of suffering. And I think because of that, I was drawn towards some way of helping myself with that and some way of solving that. I guess it led me to meditation and sort of meditative art. So I began with things like Zen and sort of more traditional practices. And I was introduced to compassion fairly early in those practices. But it didn't stick massively. I was quite driven pretty obsessive, if I'm honest, in how I was doing it. I was practicing many hours a day and going on retreats. And in a way, I was trying to solve my struggles and my difficulties. And the compassion stuff was mentioned, and I practiced bits of it, and I would come and go and come back to it. And then later, as I kind of realized that some of the ways I was approaching meditation weren't so healthy, they were a bit obsessive and a bit trying to control my emotions rather than kind of accept and make room for them. I then sort of rediscovered compassion focused therapy. I discovered Kristen Neff's work, mindful self-compassion. And ACT really was a big part of that, as you know from our discussions. ACT is I mean, primarily I'm a compassion focused therapist and an ACT therapist. They're my two main modalities. So an ACT has tons of compassion in it. So all of that became such a resource, and it almost took the kind of obsessive drive off what I was doing, brought my practice more as something to bring me into life rather than pull me out of life. And I got a lot from the likes of Paul Gilbert and other people within those traditions, their warmth, their humanity, their kindness and openness with their own struggles. So that inspired me a lot. There's a lot more I could say, but that's probably a kind of simple overview.
Wow, there is a lot to say, right? I have many, many questions. But maybe we can step back a little bit. If you will be talking to a person that doesn't know anything about self-compassion or compassion-focused therapy, how will you introduce that practice to them? If a person is struggling with harsh thoughts, I am a failure, I am unworthy, or I am unlovable, and they are curious about self-compassion, how do you introduce self-compassion to them?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one that I reflect on a lot, because it's actually seems quite a personalized thing depending on the client. And I think some of the examples you gave there, they resonate in my mind with people who are often very kind to others and aren't so kind to themselves. And that's one type of presentation, I guess. You're very good at compassion out and not so good at compassion in. There might be other barriers, other ways it sets up. I think this resonates with what you call creating a context for change. So, that how do we, I guess, open up this idea of compassion, how it could be helpful with the reason someone's coming to therapy, what they're hoping to get, and make that link of how it could support them. I guess in that example of the kind of harsh self-critic, perfectionism, you may be good at compassion out, not so good in, then I might start with that actually highlighting that misalignment with how kind and supportive someone can be to someone else versus how they are to themselves. So that asymmetry really there in that compassion. So just starting to explore that as we talk, to highlight as we're looking at what thoughts and feelings someone's coming with, and how that inner critic and that perfectionism and that the part that might turn on them and be less self-compassionate with them, just to flag it, highlight it, and show that difference between the kindness. Then I might use some of the typical metaphors that many people who listen into this podcast have probably heard and use a lot of them, but things like, in that example, the oxygen mask, the old aeroplane metaphor of, we've got to take care of ourselves to take care of others. The two friends metaphor I like, if you're facing a struggle in life and you have the option of two friends, you have one friend who is going to tell you you're rubbish, you're never going to do anything, or you're not doing enough, you got to try harder, you're weak, you're going to fail, whatever, however harsh it might be, versus the friend that says, you can do this, you've got this, I'm here with you, how can we do this together, what's our first step, let's go for this. Mostly people can kind of get that right away. So I would do some of the metaphors, some of the experiential work, the kind of setting the context of change, linking it to the goals and rationale, and then see how that lands really.
Sometimes one of the things that I hear from my clients is that if I practice that hippy dippy thing, I am going to become lazy, or I will
Yes.
be lazy, or are you asking me to do mediocre things? So how will you respond to a person that says, well, are you asking me to be less responsible? Are you asking me to be less accountable for what I do? Especially when people have high standards for themselves.
Yeah, you know, there's quite a bit in that. You know, I guess there's the one part of it where we can just language it different from the beginning. So there's no reason to use you know, softer, flowery language. We, you know, in compassion focused therapy, we often use the example of the firefighter running into the burning building. You know, he's not feeling warmth and love and nurturing at that point. Probably he's probably feeling either very adrenalized and focused, or amped up, or anxious and nervous, or something like that. But the motivation is there. So sometimes just the languaging and the framing and showing that actually we're not talking the same. I mean, from the example of California, we're perhaps not talking about the same thing as a necessarily a more spiritual approach. This is nothing wrong with a spiritual approach, and a lot of people will relate to it that way, but maybe making that clear. You know, in England, in the UK, we have the cynicism, so people are kind of more cynical about this sort of stuff, like deprecating. You know, we have the legacy of Victorian stiff upper lip and, you know, strong work ethic in some areas. So we have lots of barriers as well in that respect. So to some extent, you know, we want all of that to come up as soon as possible and start working with it, don't we? You know, and some of it might be the psychoeducation part of you know, some of the benefits of self-compassion. For some people, the research, that, you know, the benefits around everything from physiology to psychological benefits to relationship benefits, and, you know, tying it into some hard-nosed research. For some people that will work. You know, for some of my clients that don't care about research, they're too busy struggling in their life, they're trying to survive, that's not going to work for them. And they may have a traumatic background where it hasn't been safe to trust kindness and compassion. And so, you know, in that context, it might be more the slowly, you know, let's build this up. I'm not going to try immediately in session one to sell the concept of self-compassion. I'm going to let it come through time and through our relationship, and, you know, explore where these barriers come from in their history. You know, look at the attachment history. Why, you know, with that example, okay, we could address that barrier. You know, you've been in California, you've seen a lot of maybe quite out there spiritual communities and ideas floating around, and to you that doesn't seem to match up with being caring and committing to something you care about, the direction you want to go in your business. Well, what I'm talking about here isn't the same thing. So first of all, getting rid of that misconception. You know, we're not talking about getting out the incense and wind chimes and doing, you know, sound baths, unless someone wants to do all of that. So maybe, you know, getting rid of some of those misconceptions, just simply addressing them. But then also maybe looking at, you know, at a deeper level, what does this barrier mean? You know, what in your history has meant it's hard to trust the concept of being kind to yourself, receiving kindness from others. You know, where has that come from in the attachment history, in the school history, you know, in the messages you've learned? And then also that part of compassion, you know, getting rid of the misconception that compassion is letting yourself off the hook. You know, is that kind? If I care deeply about my work and I'm very motivated, you know, is it kind to just say, oh, you don't have to push yourself so hard and give up on it and, you know, go off and go surfing and don't work? You know, is that kindness? I don't think it is. So sometimes you have to tackle those very simple tangents that people's minds go off on when they hear kindness and compassion.
Yeah. I love what you're saying, because I do hear more of these blocks. So I think unpacking them before moving forward, it sounds a very helpful approach. Sometimes I hear the words or thoughts along the lines of, I don't deserve to be kind.
Yeah.
If you hear that, how will you respond?
Yeah. I think I would tackle it different ways. You know, one simple level would be compassion focused therapy loves this idea of tricky brains. Paul Gilbert calls it tricky brains. And this idea that so much of our suffering is this clash between these old brain networks and these new brain networks, and a brain that's designed to spot threats and danger and social danger and difficulty. And, you know, we didn't pick any of that. We didn't pick any of our early attachment experiences. We didn't pick any of our school experiences. I think when I get into this area, sometimes you speak to people who truly have regrets. You know, they've done stuff in their life they really do regret, and they're having trouble letting go of that. So I think sometimes you have to work on the difference between regret and shame. You know, that we can grieve and regret mistakes and things we've done, but actually at that point, we did the best we could given, you know, where we were in our life and everything we knew. And you know, and I also, at this point, I'll move into, I love our good friend Russ Harris's approach to diffusing from difficult thoughts. So he has this idea of notice, name, normalize, function, and workability. I use this a lot in this area. So first of all, you know, as we're doing here, you're noticing and naming that block to compassion. So I don't feel worthy. So this sense of I'm not worthy, or perhaps shame, it could be. And then normalizing it. Actually, so many people have this. In fact, I had this. You know, I might do some self-disclosure and say, I was so hard on myself in the past because of what I was going through, and you know, I might share a bit of how useful it's been to change that relationship. But so some noticing, naming, and normalizing there, and then the function. Okay, the function of that barrier could be many things, couldn't it? I mean, you know this super well. There's so many functions, but a common one is, you know, we prefer a familiar state of suffering than an unfamiliar state of growth often. You know, and I always link this to those animal studies that show rats will go back to an environment where they're electrocuted rather than risk going to a new territory where they don't know things. So I think this happens in our mind. We sometimes are scared of, you know, what would happen if we start being kind to ourselves.
Yeah, if we unpack this belief, I don't deserve to be kind with myself, there is so much more shame, different shades of shame and regrets. And we may notice how it feels. We may recognize the emotion and then look, what happens if I act on this feeling? If I can ask, sometimes what I have heard from my clients is that they do have a collection of regrets. They regret how they behave with other people, how they behave towards the people they love. So how would you go through that if people have this collection of regrets?
Yeah, I think it's tough, and I think it's something that often takes time. You know, in compassion focused therapy, you know, this is the kind of blocks and barriers to compassion, and sometimes that's described as that's the work in compassion focused therapy. You know, that is the main focus. If we can get through that, then we'll see a big shift in self-compassion. And I think, you know, early on when I came up against this, because I'd done a lot of work to really make sense of my own struggles in the past, and to really just say I did the best I could at that point, and really to make peace with that, and to go, actually, I couldn't have done anything different. And, you know, I was struggling with stuff that was out of my control. I was really bought into that. So it surprised me at first when my clients, they struggled to get to that place because of these guilt or shame episodes, these memories. And so, you know, I had to, and I'm still working on it and working on this. And I think not rushing to try and tidy it all up and say, okay, we all deserve compassion. We all find ourselves in this crazy world doing the best we can. We make some mistakes. It doesn't help anyone to stay stuck there on that pain. How can we compassionately self-correct? Like in the early days, I would rush through that. Now, taking more time actually and exploring those experiences, those memories, what was going on, what was the context, why the person was pulled to do the behaviors they were pulled to do. Did they really have much more choice? And if they did, I mean, my own, it soon becomes quite philosophical in this area, because you start getting into how much free will do we have and all the rest of it. And that can be a barrier in itself with clients. You get into that debate. But my own sense is, like, when you're in those strong emotions and really painful place, you have less free will. And so you're doing the best you can, and maybe you regret some stuff. Okay, we can regret that. We can grieve that together. We can just feel that, stay with that, hold that compassionately, notice what I'm feeling, thinking, add in some kindness. And we don't need to tidy that up or do anything else other than feel that. But then we do want to move into compassionate self-correction and how we make, is there anything we could do differently now, learning from that? And can we mend any of those relationships? Often there's a lot of misconception there, right? Often people are really beating themselves up for stuff that is just so far out of their control and their blame. And not to jump around here too much, but sometimes I find that links to early attachments where people have had to adjust to difficult parents by adjusting to becoming the bad guy, seeing themselves as the bad guy because they have these difficult parental environments. So they couldn't see the attachment figure as the bad guy, so they had to see themselves. So they're so used to blaming themselves. So sometimes I found we have to go back to that earlier attachment experience, make sense of that, understand that, give a lot of compassion to those memories and those times. And then that might free up, if they're not so much to blame, but they're holding themselves highly accountable for something that was way more complex. Sometimes people have done stuff, though. I've worked in the borough I work in Lewisham. I've worked with many young men coming out of gangs and criminal backgrounds, worked with people who've, they've stabbed people and done all kinds of things like that. And, just to be with them with the regret, and just to kind of, realize that in that place, they had little choice actually at that time, where they were but grieving it and allowing some space and time to grieve. And then, then we're at the function. Okay, the function is, if I stay blaming myself, then I atone for some of that a little bit. But do you really atone for it by blaming and beating yourself up and holding on to that? Or do we atone for it by doing something different in the present moment? So sometimes trying to get to that sort of post-traumatic growth, how can we do something different now to atone for it, rather than be stuck in that pain and that shame and that guilt? So I guess my mind's seeing it as there's some people blaming themselves, and that's over blame. And then there are some people that tragedy has happened, and they're almost two different things to some degree.
Yeah, I think an important consideration that you share is that it's easy to judge our behavior and ourselves for things that we have said or we have done, but makes a huge difference if we can step back and look at our own history and put our actions in context with what was going on in our lives at certain time, what we knew about ourselves, what we knew about relationships and others. Our regrets may come from that place. I don't think we can look at our regrets in isolation, but in the context of our history, which is hard to do. That's the word I'm referring to. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, I will very much appreciate it if you will subscribe and share this podcast with your friends. And if you're feeling extra generous, I welcome a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes of this episode are in the website playingitsafe.zone. Make sure to subscribe to my newsletter so you can receive more tips to stop all types of unworkable playing it safe actions. See you soon!